My name is Arthur Kowalski, and the afternoon my daughter sat across from me at my kitchen table, going pale over a stack of brokerage statements she'd found while helping me organize my taxes, was also the afternoon I finally understood that 12 years of being quietly pitied by my own children had cost all of us something I couldn't get back with a single number on a page. Denise had come over that Saturday the way she did every February, armed with a folder and a calculator, insisting on helping her old dad get his tax documents in order because, in her words, "You're on a fixed income, Dad. We don't want the IRS taking more than they're entitled to from someone in your position." I let her do it every year, partly because I appreciated the company, and partly, if I'm honest, because some part of me had grown comfortable with the story she and her brother had built about my finances, a story I'd never actively lied about, but had also never bothered to correct. She was 3 folders into my paperwork when she found the statement from Fidelity, the one I usually kept in a separate drawer, specifically because I knew it would raise questions. I wasn't ready to answer on anyone's schedule but my own. She must have grabbed it by mistake, tucked in with an old insurance form, and I watched her open it the way you'd watch someone open a door you'd been meaning to lock. "Dad." Her voice had gone strange. "What is this?" I didn't answer right away. She turned the page toward me, her finger tracing down to the account total at the bottom, a number that read $2,140,000. "Dad, is this real? Is this actually your account?" "It's real," I said quietly. Denise sat back in her chair, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger sitting in her father's kitchen. "You have over $2 million, and you've let Greg and me believe for 12 years that you were barely scraping by on your pension." I looked at my daughter, 44 years old, a woman who had spent the last decade quietly worrying about whether her father could afford his own heating bill in the winter, and I understood, watching her face work through that number, that I owed her the whole story. The same story I probably should have told both my children years earlier, long before a stray folder in a tax organizing session forced it into the open. I taught auto shop at Lincoln West High School in Cleveland for 31 years, starting in 1976, back when the school still had a fully equipped garage bay and enough budget to keep real engines on the lift for students to work on. I loved that job in a way I never quite found words to explain to anyone who hadn't also spent their career teaching, watching kids who'd been written off by every other class in the building suddenly come alive with a wrench in their hand and an actual problem in front of them that their hands, not their test scores, could solve. My wife Carol taught 3rd grade at an elementary school 2 miles away, and between the two of us, we raised Greg and Denise on 2 modest teacher salaries in a house on Denison Avenue that we paid off slowly over about 20 years. We weren't poor, not by any stretch, but we also weren't the kind of family that took vacations to anywhere requiring a passport. And both kids grew up with a clear-eyed understanding that money in our house got planned carefully and spent deliberately. In 1994, working on my own truck in my garage on a Saturday afternoon, I've got frustrated enough with a socket set that kept slipping on a particular bolt configuration that I spent the next several weekends designing a small adapter attachment to solve the problem. Something simple, almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight, but effective enough that I brought a prototype to school and had half my shop students asking where they could buy one. I patented the design in 1996, mostly on a whim, and mostly because a lawyer friend of Carol's talked me through the process for a modest fee, and I licensed it 2 years later to a mid-sized tool manufacturer out of Wisconsin for what seemed, at the time, like a reasonable but unremarkable royalty arrangement. That royalty check arrived quarterly for the next 28 years, starting small, a few $1,000s a quarter in the late 90s, but growing steadily as the manufacturer expanded distribution and the adapter became a modest but consistent seller in hardware stores and auto parts chains across the country. I never mentioned the patent much to anyone outside the family, partly because it felt like an oddity rather than an identity, a school teacher who happened to also hold a minor patent, and partly because Carol and I made a decision early on, together, about what we intended to do with that unexpected income. We didn't change our lifestyle, not one bit. We kept driving the same reliable, unglamorous cars. We kept living in the same house on Denison Avenue. Instead, every royalty check went straight into an investment account. Carol helped me set up with a financial advisor she trusted, split mostly between index funds and a handful of individual stocks we researched together on Saturday evenings, the same evenings we'd once spent balancing the household budget when money was considerably tighter. Carol passed 11 years ago, breast cancer that gave us a hard 14 months from diagnosis to funeral, and I retired from teaching the following year, partly because 31 years felt like a natural stopping point, and partly because grief had taken something out of me that I wasn't sure the classroom could give back. What Carol left behind, beyond the obvious and much larger loss of her actual presence, was a fully organized investment account and a clear set of instructions, written in her own careful handwriting, about how she wanted us to continue growing what we'd built together, quietly, without drawing attention to it, the same way we'd always lived. I retired onto a modest teacher's pension, which is the version of my financial situation my children have understood for the last 12 years, because that pension really was, and still is, the only income either of them has ever asked me directly about. I never lied to either of them, not technically. I simply never volunteered the rest of the story, and somewhere along the way, their assumption about my finances calcified into something neither of us ever thought to question out loud. I want to be honest about why I let that assumption stand for as long as I did, because I think the reasons matter more than the simple fact of the secrecy itself. About 3 years after Carol passed, Greg came to me needing help with a down payment on a house, a reasonable, ordinary request that most fathers with the means to help would consider without much hesitation. I told him I couldn't spare it, that my pension didn't leave much room for a gift of that size, and I watched him accept that answer with visible disappointment but no argument, because the story he'd already built in his head about my finances made my refusal seem entirely reasonable. I regretted that lie almost immediately, and I want to be clear that it was, in fact, a lie, a more direct one than the passive omission that followed it. But once I'd told it, correcting it felt like it would require an explanation for why I'd told it in the first place. And that explanation, even to myself, felt uncomfortably tangled up with feelings about Carol's death, about grief, about a private need I hadn't fully examined yet to see what my children would do, how they'd treat me, if they genuinely believed I had very little to offer them beyond my own presence. I think some part of me, grieving Carol and adjusting to a life alone for the first time in 4 decades, wanted to know whether my children's attention and care for me existed independently of what I could provide them financially. It's not a flattering motive, and I've had a lot of years since to sit with how unfair a test that actually was to put my own children through without their knowledge or consent. What I learned over the following decade was more complicated than a simple confirmation either way. Greg, now 41, works as a regional sales manager and has never once, in the 12 years since that first conversation about the down payment, asked me for money again. He visits me a few times a year, mostly around holidays, calls every couple of weeks, and I don't doubt that he loves me in his own way. But I also noticed, over those years, a particular pattern that I think grew directly out of his belief about my finances. He stopped inviting me to family vacations, explaining once, with what he clearly believed was thoughtfulness, that he didn't want to put me in the position of having to say I couldn't afford to join them. Or, worse, feeling obligated to spend money he assumed I didn't have. He started buying me smaller, more modest gifts at Christmas, a gesture I think he intended as sensitivity to my supposed financial constraints, but that landed, on my end, as a quiet kind of pity dressed up as consideration. Denai, similarly, took to insisting on paying for our meals whenever we went out together, waving off my attempts to split the bill with a gentle but firm, "Dad, don't worry about it, I've got this." A kindness on its surface that carried, underneath it, an assumption about my capacity to provide for myself that I'd never actually corrected. She started handling my taxes every year, ostensibly to save me money on an accountant, but I think also because some part of her had begun quietly worrying about whether I was managing my modest pension responsibly enough on my own. Neither of my children was ever cruel to me during those 12 years, and I want to be fair about that because this isn't a story about children who mocked or abandoned their father. It's a more complicated story about the particular kind of distance that grows between people when one person's economic reality gets misjudged and the other person, for reasons of pride or grief or a need to understand something true about love, lets that misjudgment stand uncorrected for far longer than they should have. What I noticed watching this dynamic unfold over the years was that both my children's care for me had quietly shrunk to fit the smaller container they'd built in their minds. Fewer invitations, because they assumed I couldn't afford to participate fully. Smaller gifts, because they assumed larger ones might embarrass me by contrast with my own supposed means. A gentle but persistent condescension in how they discussed my finances with each other. Sometimes within my hearing, phrases like, "We should check in on Dad's budget before the holidays," or "Let's make sure whatever we plan doesn't put him in an awkward spot financially." The one person in the family who never treated me according to that assumption was my granddaughter Sophie, Denise's daughter, who was 14 when Coral passed and has spent the 11 years since building a relationship with me that had nothing to do with money at all. Sophie started coming over on weekends not long after her grandmother's funeral, initially, I think, out of a teenager's grief-driven need to feel close to someone who'd loved her grandmother the way she had. She asked me to teach her things in the garage, the same way my shop students once asked, curious about engines and torque wrenches, and the particular satisfaction of fixing something with your own two hands rather than paying someone else to fix it for you. Sophie never once asked me for anything beyond my time and attention. She showed up for holidays regardless of whether they were the expensive kind or the modest kind. She called just to talk about nothing in particular, the way a person calls someone they simply enjoy being around, rather than someone they feel obligated to check in on. By the time she went off to college 8 years ago, studying mechanical engineering, a path I like to think our Saturday afternoons in the garage had at least some small hand in shaping, Sophie had become, without either of us ever naming it out loud, the person in my family who knew me most completely, financial assumptions or not, because she'd simply never built her relationship with me around any assumption about money in the first place. A former student of mine, Miguel Torres, has occupied a similar space in my life over the years, though through a very different history. Miguel was one of my shop students in the late 80s, a kid from a rough patch of the neighborhood whose home life, from what I could gather at the time, gave him precious little stability outside the four walls of my classroom. I co-signed his first tool loan when he graduated, helping him get the equipment he needed to start working as an apprentice mechanic, a debt he paid back faithfully over the following 2 years without me ever having to remind him of the schedule. Miguel built his own auto repair shop eventually, a successful one, and has never once let a year pass without checking in on me, showing up unannounced when my truck needs work, calling every few weeks just to talk shop, in every sense of that phrase. When I had a minor cardiac scare 6 years ago, it was Miguel, not either of my own children, who happened to be visiting that particular afternoon and who drove me to the emergency room himself, staying until a doctor confirmed I was stable enough to go home. I never corrected Miguel's understanding of my finances either, though I think, if I'm honest, it mattered less in his case, because Miguel's presence in my life had never depended on any assumption about money to begin with. He simply showed up the same way Sophie simply showed up, because some people build relationships around genuine presence and others, without quite meaning to, build them around a story they've told themselves about what the other person needs or deserves. About 4 years ago, having watched my investment account grow steadily well beyond anything Carol and I had originally imagined when we first started that quiet Saturday evening ritual of researching stocks together, I sat down with a new financial advisor, a careful, patient woman named Rachel Voss, to think through what I actually wanted to do with the money in the years I had left. I decided, working with Rachel over the following months, to establish a scholarship fund at Lincoln West High School, specifically for students pursuing vocational and technical education, the same kind of program that had shaped my entire career and, I believed, still mattered enormously for kids whose gifts didn't show up neatly on a standardized test. I funded it initially with $300,000, with plans to grow it further over time, and I named it, after some deliberation, the Carol Kowalski Memorial Fund for Technical Education, in honor of the woman who'd sat beside me on all those Saturday evenings, making the quiet decisions that eventually made a fund like this possible at all. I also began working with Rachel on my broader estate plan, deciding how the remainder of my accumulated wealth should eventually be distributed. I want to be honest that Sophie's name appears prominently in that plan, a substantial trust that will fund the remainder of her education and give her a meaningful head start in whatever career she eventually builds. A decision I made not out of any calculation about fairness between my grandchildren, since Sophie is currently my only one, but simply because she has spent 11 years showing up for me in a way neither of my own children fully managed to during that same stretch. and I wanted that presence acknowledged in a way that went beyond simple sentiment. Miguel's name appears in that plan too, a smaller but still meaningful bequest, along with an ongoing commitment to help fund tool grants for his own apprentices, a small continuation of the same kind of help I once gave him decades earlier. Greg and Denise are both provided for as well, substantially, because whatever complicated feelings I've carried about the last 12 years, they are still my children, and I never once intended, in any version of this plan, to leave either of them with nothing. But I want to be honest that the plan reflects, in its structure and its emphasis, a clear-eyed accounting of who actually showed up during the years my finances were, by my own choice, obscured from view. I hadn't planned to reveal any of this on a random Saturday afternoon over a folder of tax documents. I'd imagined, if I imagined the reveal at all, some more deliberate conversation, chosen on my own terms at a time I felt ready for it. But Denise found that fidelity statement, and once she found it, there was no version of that afternoon that didn't require me to finally tell her the truth I'd been quietly carrying for over a decade. "Dad, why?" she asked. Once I'd walked her through the basic outline, the patent, the royalties, Carol's involvement in the early investment decisions, the decision to keep our lifestyle modest despite the growing account. "Why would you let us believe you were struggling all these years?" I told her honestly, the same explanation I'd been slowly working out for myself over the previous decade of quiet observation. Some part of me wanted to know whether you and your brother would still show up for me the way you did, without the incentive of an inheritance shaping how you treated me. And I think, honestly, Denise, what I learned is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Neither of you ever mistreated me, but I noticed both of you shrinking how much you included me in things, assuming I couldn't afford to participate, treating me with a kind of careful pity that, frankly, hurt more than either of you probably realized. Denise sat with that for a long moment, her face working through something that looked like shame layered over hurt. "We excluded you from things because we thought we were being considerate," she said. "The Cancun trip 2 years ago, we didn't invite you because Greg said it wouldn't be fair to put you in a position where you'd feel like you had to say no to something you couldn't afford." "I would have loved to have been asked," I told her, "even if I'd said no myself for whatever reason. Being quietly excluded because someone else decided, on my behalf, what I could or couldn't afford felt like a smaller kind of loneliness that built up over the years in ways I don't think either of you ever intended." "I feel sick about this, Dad," Denise said. $2 million, and we've been treating you like you needed help just affording groceries." "You never treated me that badly," I said, wanting to be fair to her, even in that difficult moment. But there's a difference between not treating someone badly and actually seeing them clearly. I don't think either of you saw me clearly for a lot of these last 12 years, and honestly, that's partly my own doing for letting the misunderstanding stand as long as I did. Greg found out later that same week when Denise, understandably unable to sit on information of that magnitude alone, called and told him everything. He drove over the following weekend, and I watched my son sit across the same kitchen table, working through a version of the same shame and confusion his sister had already processed a few days earlier. "Dad, the house down payment," he said. 8 years ago, you told me you couldn't help because of your pension. I lied to you that day," I admitted. "It's the one part of this I regret most clearly, without any complicated feelings attached to it. I could have helped you, easily, and I chose not to, and I told you a story about why that wasn't entirely true. I'm sorry for that specifically, separate from everything else." Greg sat with that for a long moment. Why that particular moment? Why did that become the point where the lie actually started? "Because it was the first real test," I said. "The first time one of you needed something from me that would have required me to either tell the truth about my finances or actively lie about them. And in that moment, grieving your mother, still working through what it meant to be a person alone for the first time in decades, I chose the lie, and once I'd told it, everything after that became easier to build on top of, rather than dig back out from underneath. I've spent 8 years feeling a little bit resentful, honestly," Greg admitted, his voice quieter now. "Not toward you exactly, but toward the situation, feeling like I couldn't lean on you the way some of my friends leaned on their own parents for things like that. I think that resentment made me pull back from you more than I probably realized, telling myself I was being independent when really I think I was also just a little bit hurt." "I understand that," I told him. "And I think hearing you say that now, I understand more clearly what my choice actually cost both of us. not just in terms of a down payment, but in terms of how much distance it quietly built between us over the years that followed. The months after that revelation were harder, in some ways, than I expected them to be, precisely because there was no single villain in the story to be angry at, no clean moment of betrayal that either side could point to and demand an apology for. Instead, there was a slow, mutual untangling of assumptions, mine about what I needed to test in my own children, theirs about what my finances actually allowed for, and neither of us had a clear script for how to move forward from that kind of shared, complicated misunderstanding. Denai started coming over more frequently, not out of the same careful, slightly pitying obligation as before, but with a kind of curiosity about who her father actually was, beyond the version she'd built in her head over the previous decade. She asked me, for the first time in years, real questions about the patent, about the investment decisions Carol and I had made together, about what it had actually been like teaching shop class for 3 decades. I found myself talking more openly with her than I had in years, precisely because the secret that had quietly shaped so much of our relationship no longer needed protecting. Greg took longer to fully work through his own complicated feelings. Understandably, given how directly the lie about the down payment had touched his own life. But he started calling more consistently, and about 4 months after that initial revelation, he asked if he could bring his own son, my grandson Ethan, over on Saturdays to spend time in the garage, the same tradition Sophie had built with me a decade earlier. "I want him to actually know you," Greg told me, "not the version of you I think I've been quietly teaching him without meaning to, some slightly pitiable old man on a fixed income. I want him to know the actual person who built 2 businesses, essentially, one out of teaching and one out of a socket wrench adapter he designed in his garage on a Saturday afternoon." Sophie, hearing about the whole revelation from her mother, called me directly, her voice carrying more amusement than shock, which somehow felt entirely appropriate given how little her own relationship with me had ever depended on any assumption about my finances in the first place. "Grandpa, I have to admit, I'm not even that surprised," she said. "You've always been the smartest person I know about actually understanding how things work, engines, tools, and apparently the stock market too. I just wish Mom and Uncle Greg had gotten to see that side of you the way I have, all these years." The scholarship fund at Lincoln West held its first award ceremony last spring. A modest affair in the school's auditorium, 5 students receiving awards ranging from $2,000 to $5,000 toward technical certification programs and community college vocational tracks. I spoke briefly at that ceremony mentioning Carol, mentioning the particular satisfaction I'd found over 3 decades watching kids discover that their hands could solve problems just as elegantly as anyone else's mind could. And I noticed, sitting in the audience, both Greg and Denise present together for the first time in years at an event that had nothing to do with a holiday obligation, simply there because they wanted to understand this part of my life more fully. Afterward, one of the scholarship recipients, a quiet 17-year-old named Marcus who reminded me, in ways I couldn't fully articulate, of Miguel at that same age decades earlier, came up to thank me directly, and I watched Denise, standing a few feet away, listen to that exchange with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years, something like genuine pride, unclouded by any quiet worry about whether her father could actually afford the gesture he'd just made. I sat with my family last Thanksgiving, an ordinary meal at my house on Denison Avenue, Sophie home from her engineering job now, Ethan old enough to ask his own careful questions about torque wrenches, Miguel stopping by for dessert the way he has most years, and Greg and Denise both present without the careful, pitying undertone that had quietly shaped so many of our gatherings over the previous decade. I understood, watching that table fill up with a family finally seeing each other more clearly than they had in years, that the money itself had never really been the point of any of this. The point had always been whether the people who loved me would show up the same way regardless of what they believed I had to offer them. And the honest, complicated answer, 12 years and 1 accidental tax folder later, is that most of them eventually did, once they finally understood the whole picture clearly enough to actually see it. If this story reminded you of an assumption you've quietly built about someone in your own life, about what they need, what they can afford, or what they deserve from you, based on a story you've never actually confirmed with them directly, maybe it's worth asking the honest question before more years pass building distance around a misunderstanding neither of you ever intended. And if this one stayed with you, Share it with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe for more true stories about family, money, and the quiet ways love can grow smaller than it needs to when it's built on assumptions instead of the truth.